question with all of the teachings, whether that's the words of ancient Zen masters or some of the work we do with modern psychology or anything else, is always, how does this show up as me? How is it present in my life as it is? And so with that in mind, I wanted to use a phrase of Dogen's from Genjo Koan, and I think next week we'll probably look more properly at Genjo Koan, or start looking more properly at Genjo Koan. But it just occurred to me that this phrase was incredibly relevant to what this evening's talk is actually about, which is the way we think about ourselves, the way we talk about ourselves. So, classic, you will know this. To study the self is to forget the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And as always, I want to put the caveat on here that, am I claiming that what I'm going to say this evening is exactly what Dogen's mind was when he was writing this? Of course not. That's long ago and far away. But I think there are things we can say about this phrase which are very relevant to how we practice, and what our practice is for, and maybe some of the ways that our practice perhaps could use a little improvement. Do we study the self? Do we forget the self? If we do so, how do we? And how do we see that? Is this something which is done once and for all? Or is it always a process, always renewed? I think you could argue that traditionally Zen has laid rather more stress on forgetting the self than studying the self. We talk about no self, the loss of self, the death of the self. I want to rush off and see how quickly can we bring that about. And clearly that's not studying the self. If we wanted to make an equally caricatured criticism of contemporary Western Zen practice, we could say that we tend to study the self again, study the self some more, and maybe we're not so good at the forgetting. As I say, is this something we do in sequence? Is this, I study the self, then I can forget the self, and that's fine? Or is actually, well, no, to study the self is to forget the self. Oh, so it's not A then B, it's this is the same thing. How does that work? Come back to self endlessly. Self and no self. Self and loss of self. Bad self and good, no self. Bad ego, good egolessness. Sounds like classic Buddhism. But it's also completely dualistic thinking. We're separating, we're taking apart. We're putting the good stuff on one side, we're putting the bad stuff on the other. And actually that doesn't sound very Zen, does it? Because that's surely what we're trying to do is think non-dualistically. And in actual fact what we're doing is we're being classically judgmental. And we keep coming back to this, the court of law. The court of law is always our model. It's not like the amoeba's going round with its own court of law and making judgments. The court of law is something our society does, but which we all, each and every one of us, internalises the court of self. And in the court of self, self is very often found wanting. If we're Zenists, if we're Buddhists, very often we'll want to put the self in the stocks, or try and lock it up in a dungeon, or parade it through the street and have rotten fruit, eggs thrown at it. We can't vilify the self enough. Myself did it. It was my ego acting up. And so we have a choice. We can either take the self as that which we separate, and we can then say, oh, I have a true self, or oh, I have no self. But the self as the problem, the thing which needs fixing, or maybe can't be fixed, maybe just its mere existence is enough. Or I can actually say, well, no, I am that thing. I am so dreadful. I am selfish. I think unspeakable thoughts. I do unspeakable things. I fail. And that, of course, is the foundation of the shame spiral. And we know once we begin to judge ourselves, there is no limit, because the very act of feeling shame is in itself shameful, more shameful than anything else we could imagine. And so we can judge ourselves for feeling shame. We can judge ourselves for being these pathetic selves that experience these emotions because they're failing, because they're lacking, because they're... And this in itself is completely dualistic thinking. And if we think about being good within our, not so much the Zen tradition, but our Western tradition, what is being good? Being good is not doing what you want. Being good is being selfless rather than selfish. Being good is denying. Being good is not following one's own desire, one's own inclination. And within that, we're caught in an absolute bifurcation, a dualism. Both freeze, both pass judgment, and that judgment is absolute and freezes. It freezes ourself. And as I say, is this natural? Is this what the amoeba does, or what my dog does? I'm pretty sure not. But if we think about what our society does, well, this is absolutely what our society does at the interpersonal level all the time. Never in history has there been a society in which each and every individual is so assessed, so quantified, so objectified, so judged. And we internalise this judgment, and we judge ourselves perpetually and endlessly. And as I've just been outlining, we only have two options here, really. Either it wasn't me, it was myself what done it, Your Honour, or no, it was me. I really am that bad. We need a way out of this. But actually, let's think socially again on what we've been talking about the last couple of talks. Mastery, this infinite self-expansion of the Western mind, the Western intellect, to absorb the whole world, all its people, all its natural resources, this is this image of the self writ large. And if we think about that dream of mastery, that regime of mastery, and its relation to the dialectic of the master and the slave, either you're the subject that rules or you're the object which is ruled. And of course, if we think psychologically, psychoanalytically in these terms, we're into the kind of split between sadism and masochism. At any given moment, am I the one in control, demanding control? It wasn't me, it was the other. That's what we're doing when we're separating all the time. We're othering parts of ourselves, othering others. So either we're in the master, it wasn't my fault, or we're in the position of yes, it was, accepting that abjection of being the mastered. Now, before we dive off into fantasies of whatever kind, we can talk about the very mundane, humdrum way in which that masochistic position shows up as us over and over and over again. My teacher Barry's little saying, we find ourselves a day late and $1 short. It's never quite enough. We never quite make the grade. There's always something lacking in my world, my experience, myself, no matter where we locate it. A day late and $1 short. We find it in our speech too. I should have, people endlessly come and say, oh, I should be sitting more. I know I should. Or I should be approaching my practice in this way, not that way. Or I shouldn't be thinking these thoughts. Or, practice is, I find myself catching myself out. And when we say, I should be sitting more, well, again, let's go back to Barry. Somebody comes in and says to him, oh, I really should be sitting more. And Barry says, no. Yeah, but no. Not, no, you shouldn't be sitting more, but no. You're coming at this from the wrong angle. It's not a you. It's not a you and a responsibility, you and an obligation, you and a desire. That's not what our practice is about. And I might say to that same statement, says who? Who is this saying, oh, you should be sitting more? What is this voice? Where's it actually coming from? I keep pointing out because it's worth just checking and flagging up every time we notice this. The kind of way that the moralizing creeps in, that we bring the moralizing back in. Why do we do that? Well, Joko might say, and in a sense she's right. Oh, because we like it that way. It's familiar, it's comforting. But again then, that's kind of suggesting fault here. I'm doing it. There's this self doing it. What's really going on here? And actually everything I've said so far is about studying the self. Where's the forgetting gone? To study the self is to forget the self. So where's the forgetting in all of this? Everything I've said allows the self to stay at the centre. But of course the point is, and this is what the study of the self should show us, is that the self is only ever relationship. It's only ever the tissue of interweaving relationship, as which I find myself, as which I experience myself, out of which experiencing I construct this idea of a self, which I can see in all its different relationships acting, and I give it a sort of coherence. But because this is a tissue of changing relationships, this self, moment by moment, is changing, reinventing. And this applies equally in my relationships with things, which can function as selves, repositories of memory, repositories of desire. Even if that's as banal as the tap that drips, or my pen with which I write my diary, or of course ourselves, because we are all always multiple. We are always traversed by so many different desires, fears. And we don't have a separate, fixed, unique self outside all these things. So we could say this self is produced as relationship. And in that sense, there is nothing to judge. No one fixed, stable, separate thing called a self, called a me, to hold responsible. Nothing to fix, nothing to freeze, nothing to separate. Freedom is relationship, is not separate. Autonomy is relationship, is not separate. Responsibility is relationship, is not separate. All of these things are relational. None of these things can be pinned on a separate self to be locked in a dungeon, paraded through the streets, set in the stocks, or owned by me. So to study the formation of the self, to see why and how we self in the way that we do, is to not see this emptiness, this relationality as an abstract thing, a separate thing, a transcendent spiritual thing. It's to see it as just the actuality, just the reality of what we are. And seeing that can be, should be, if we take it seriously, the experience of liberation. If I catch myself out, am I seeing something I've done? If I find I've thought an unworthy thought, a misogynistic thought, a racist thought, whatever, anything which I would naturally, have I been bad? Is there something fundamentally bad going on here? Or have I merely observed that in me, the world has tied a knot? And as such, I'm free to frame my own response to it. I'm free to change this. I'm free to question my response. I'm key to act in ways which undo these knots. Liberation It's really simply to experience oneself as a world, to experience oneself non-dually, not as something which can be judged and damned, but as a being, a self, the product of its circumstances, and hence free to aspire to a relational responsibility, free to aspire to some relational relative autonomy, free, relatively, relationally, to choose, to act differently. It's here that I think the fundamental difference between what we do with practice and therapy lies. There are obviously therapeutic aspects to our work. There is obviously this concern with studying the self. But we have to understand that our studying the self is also a forgetting of the self. I am world. I am nothing but world. World, worlding as me. In this sense, there is no judgment to be made. Now, just to be absolutely clear about this, if I see a truck coming, I step out the way. If I see somebody attacking somebody else, do I intervene? Do I not? That's a judgment to be made in this moment. It's not that kind of judgment we're talking about. It's not the response. It's not the merely living life as it is. It's this separating out. It's this freezing. It's this judging as separate, as other. And the effect that has on me, and the effect my infinite propensity to judge has on others. But I judge because I am judged. I judge because I have been judged. My freedom is in stopping. My freedom is in this sense, restraining the judgments on others, the judgments of others that flow through me, as me. It's not about me. And this realization that it's not about me is, in a sense, liberation. To study the self is to forget the self. It really isn't about me.